Hey, this is Paul with MakeUseOf.com, and if you're considering buying or upgrading to Apple's latest Pro device, I'll be giving you my experience using the iPhone 14 Pro for the past couple weeks and sharing my thoughts on how it compares to last year's iPhone 13 mini. And throughout this review, I'll also be explaining why I think the iPhone 14 Pro is one of the best, if not the best, sub $1,000 premium device that you can buy in 2022. And notice I did say premium because for $1,000, that is a lot of money, of course. And for about $500 or less, you can definitely still get a lot of great devices. They just won't have as many of the unique features that the new 14 Pro offers. And with that said, if you're coming from, say, the 13 Pro or even the 13 mini or actually any other recent iPhone, the experience for the most part is going to remain the same. It's just those extra features like the dynamic island, the better screen, and of course the improved cameras. That's what's going to take this phone to the next level and perhaps entice you to upgrade or switch to this device. I first switched from Android with my Samsung Galaxy Note 9 to an iPhone, with my first iPhone being the iPhone 11 in 2019. I've since been upgrading to the newest iPhone every year. With the introduction of the mini series, I have owned both the Mini 12 as well as the Mini 13. Which I then upgraded to the iPhone 14 Pro this year. And actually, I would have been happy to stay with the mini series because, in my opinion, it's just the perfect size. It fits in your hand very well, it fits in your pocket, it's not too heavy. And with the exception of some of the Pro features that you can get, the mini series is basically the same phone at its core. And so I was pretty upset to hear that the $700 mini series was going to be discontinued indefinitely. And so with the new 14 series starting with the regular 14 at $799, the 14 Plus at $899, and the 14 Pro for $999, and then you have the 14 Pro Max for $1099. I personally felt that the regular size 6.1-inch 14 Pro was worth the $200 premium over the regular 14, but not quite worth it enough to upgrade to the 6.7-inch, and in fact, I thought that'd just be a little bit too big. I purchased the 128GB 14 Pro in Space Black for $999. This is my most expensive phone purchase to date. And while I do miss the days of a premium sub $500 smartphone, I still feel like the 14 Pro offers enough in terms of features. And one of the most important things to me is actually having a very powerful camera that I can rely on both for stills and video work. Now, when compared to last year's iPhone 13 Pro, the 14 Pro has the same shape and button layout with the lock button on the right and its silent and volume rocker on the left. With its larger camera bumps and higher capacity battery, the 14 Pro is slightly heavier and thicker than the 13 Pro. It now weighs 206 grams compared to 204 grams from last year, and it measures 5.81 inches by 2.81 inches by 0.31 inches. In reality, the size difference and weight difference between the two devices won't feel much different in hand, and as the overall device hasn't changed much, it wouldn't actually be hard to confuse the two with each other. The 14 Pro is currently available in 4 colors: deep purple, gold, silver, and space black. That's actually one less than the 13 Pro. Alpine green, which was my favorite color from last year, as well as Sierra blue are no longer available, but they did add deep purple, which is a nice addition for this year. Something that isn't immediately noticeable when you get the iPhone 14 Pro, and this is definitely the case with me, is that I didn't realize you wouldn't have a SIM tray. I read about it, but I completely forgot about it. And so when I had it in hand, I'm like, where do I put my SIM card in? And then I'm like, oh, no more SIM card tray. So luckily, my carrier, Visible, which is a subsidiary of Verizon, as well as a lot of other US carriers, make it easy to switch to an eSIM. So hopefully that process isn't an issue for you. That said, something that could be a bigger issue for US users is that if you plan on traveling a lot overseas, it's a big benefit to be able to just pop in a SIM card whenever you travel to a new country just for a couple weeks, months, and to just get service really quickly that way. I'm not too sure how easily that's going to be with other international carriers, so that is something to keep in mind. Now, spec-wise, the 14 Pro, again, is almost identical to the 13 Pro. The 14 Pro still comes with 6GB of RAM and is available in 128GB, 256GB, 512, or 1TB of storage. And just with the 13 Pro, another thing that you should keep in mind is that when buying the 128GB model, as I did, you're going to be limited to recording ProRes video at just 1080p 30 frames per second. 4K is unavailable because they think oh, users aren't going to be smart enough to realize that the storage is going to be eaten up quickly. I think that's really dumb, especially considering this is a pro device. I know how much storage is being used as I'm recording video. I can make that decision on my own, so it's very unfortunate that they lock us out of that. Now, this is interesting. Unlike last year's iPhone series, which all had the A15 processor, Apple has instead decided to make the new 4nm A16 Bionic chip exclusive to just the Pro lineup. And so the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus are still stuck with the older A15 processor. But as the newer A16 is still a 6-core CPU, 5-core GPU with 16-core neural engine chip, in reality, most users probably will never notice a difference. Synthetic benchmarks do show that the A16 is between 10 to 22% faster in certain tests with the CPU and GPU and RAM. But when it comes to 3D Mark, for example, which gives you a better idea for gaming performance, we see about a 4% improvement. And again, the other important thing when making a decision to upgrade from a previous iPhone, whether it's the 13 Pro, the 13 mini, or any other older iPhone, those phones, when they came out, were at the top of their game, and they were one of the best devices at the time, and for the most part, they still are some of the best devices. The processor in these phones is very much overkill for most day-to-day tasks, and in reality, unless you're doing a lot of heavy video or photo editing, and maybe certain games and other 3D tasks, for the most part, you're never going to come close to using the full potential of these devices. And with that, the point I want to stress is the CPU, GPU, and RAM improvements between these devices shouldn't necessarily be the main reason you want to upgrade. Instead, the more efficient A16 chip is going to help provide about an hour of extra battery life on the iPhone 14 Pro for a total of about 23 hours of video playback. That again is in part to the more efficient chip, as well as the slightly larger battery, which is now 3200 milliamps compared to the 3095 milliamp battery that came with a 13 Pro. Now, coming from the 13 mini, which only had about 16 or 17 hours of max video playback, that 6-hour gain that I now have with the 14 Pro is massive. And since upgrading, battery anxiety has pretty much become a thing of the past. Now, I'm actually someone who often forgets to charge their phone at night. I can start a day at about 75% of battery at 9 a.m. and end the day with about 25% still by 10 p.m. And that's with about 5 hours of screen on time. And like I was saying, although there is the iPhone 14 Pro Max, which has the massive 6.1-inch display, coming from the 5.4 inch of my iPhone 13 mini, I find 6.1 inch to be a good sweet spot. Another difference though between the iPhone 14 Pro and the iPhone 13 is that the 14 Pro's Pro Motion can now go as low as 1 Hz compared to just 10 Hz on the 13 Pro. This allows the display to consume less battery when viewing static content like news articles or photos, but it also introduces the always-on display. It is great that iPhones finally have this feature that Androids have had for several years, but it's not something that I'll be using. I found the new feature of Dynamic Island to be an excellent implementation of software and UI to overcome the hardware limitations, but it's very Apple to make it exclusive to just the Pro lineup. It does have several benefits, including quickly showing you relevant information like your navigation directions or media playback controls, as well as a few others, but I wouldn't go as far as calling it a pro feature. And if you're considering the iPhone 14 Pro between the iPhone 14 and you're thinking, should I pay the extra $200 premium just for Dynamic Island? It's pretty great and it can be exciting to use, but I'm not too sure it's worth $200. Apple did a great job at making the touch responsiveness of this black notch feel like any other part of your display. The notch wiggles and moves to your touches. The physical notch cutout is actually a little bit smaller than it digitally appears most of the time. It's hard to tell, but under the right lighting and at the right angle, you can actually tell that it's two separate cutouts, one for the camera itself and the others for the front sensors. When the display turns on, the deep blacks on screen make the notch appear as one single cutout. When the notch displays information like your directions from Apple Maps, it widens on both sides and it will show the direction to take on the left-hand side and then the distance on the right. Surprisingly, Dynamic Island has become one of my favorite features with the iPhone 14 Pro. At first I thought it was going to be a gimmick, but I actually use it all the time. Now, as a photographer and videographer, I was most excited to try out the iPhone 14 Pro's new cameras. Now, in my article on makeuseof.com, I go into more detail about these 3 different lenses and how to take full advantage of them, as well as my thoughts and opinions on how they compare. But for right now, here's the main summary. While Apple has continually improved their cameras with bigger and faster sensors and better software, this is actually the first time in 7 years since the iPhone 6 in 2015 that we've actually seen a bump up from 12 megapixels on its primary lens to now 48 megapixels. When you consider that Android phones like the Samsung Galaxies have had 50 plus megapixel cameras for several years now, it might not seem very impressive, but this is Apple doing it on their iPhones, which means they've done it right. All three of the rear cameras can shoot at 4K 24, 25, 30, or 60 frames per second, as well as at 1080p with the included 120 and 240 frames per second. You have 10-bit HDR, Dolby Vision HDR up to 60 frames per second, and ProRes. Cinematic mode is supported at 4K 24 and 30 frames per second, and that was previously limited to just 1080p 30 frames per second on the previous iPhones. I also think cinematic mode is much more usable this year. When switching between subjects and tracking, it works faster and is also more accurate. The digital effect still isn't a real replacement for actual bokeh, but it can be very effective for the right subjects and lighting. Cinematic mode still isn't available when shooting in ProRes, and that should highlight how this really isn't intended as a pro feature, despite Apple's continued push with all their marketing. For more casual content though, I still think it can really up the production value when done right. But in my opinion, if you want to take full advantage of these cameras, you should probably get a third-party app like Moment, which allows you to shoot in full manual controls that includes ISO, shutter speed, and more. I find it disappointing that Apple's default camera app still doesn't offer full manual controls, and it's very apparent that when you've actually dialed in the correct ISO and shutter speed properly, your videos look outstanding, even in very low light scenes. Apple claims that their new 48 megapixel f1.8 24mm wide angle lens is about 65% larger, and it allows for up to 2 times better low light performance compared to the iPhone 13 Pro. By default, the iPhone 14 Pro will still take 12 megapixel stills. However, there is now 4 times more detail because of its quad pixel setup. In order to take those 48 megapixel stills, you need to toggle Pro RAW from the top of the camera app. This gives you additional editing control over your images and helps you achieve more of that pro look without being stuck with your camera's baked-in processing, which I often find to be too saturated and sharp. But when shooting in Pro RAW, keep in mind that your file sizes can be very large, between 60 to 100 megabytes depending on how much detail is captured. The 12 megapixel 77mm telephoto lens is unchanged from the iPhone 13 Pro, but you still might be able to achieve slightly better low light as well as sharper images because of its improved computational photography thanks to the A16 processor. The iPhone 14 Pro's front-facing 12 megapixel camera is now f1.9 compared to the iPhone 13's f2.2. It now also supports autofocus. This year's selfie camera can also shoot cinematic at 4K 24 or 30 frames per second. And just as with the cinematic modes on the rear lenses, I found myself using this mode far more frequently because it actually worked better. It was very pleasing, and provided your subject or background isn't too complicated, the bokeh can also be very convincing. Crazy hair strands or wearing glasses can still throw it off and ruin the illusion, but again, for more casual content or just vlogging, I actually think it's a very good effect. And so the iPhone 14 Pro continues to be an excellent choice for users who want the absolute best pro phone experience. In truth, the iPhone 14 Pro, as well as many of its predecessors, are still very overkill for most users, but if you want the best display and camera with excellent performance, it's probably the best premium phone that you can buy for under $1,000 in 2022. So thank you again for checking out this video. This has been Paul with MakeUseOf.com. Let us know your thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro, as well as the rest of the 14 series. And until the next one, we'll catch you later.